when we go from the three speakers we're about to hear onto the panel discussion, the conversation, we'll need time to set up mics, and for that reason we'll give you good time to stretch and walk around and recover physically. I shouldn't be here. I'm just a friend that dropped in and should not be playing this role, and I argued against it, but Noreen insisted, so I'll take advantage of the opportunity she unwittingly created and have a gotcha moment. We have in the room today the two people most responsible for the wonderful, benign presence of this center in the middle of Manhattan. In different styles, in their own ways, both Harold Agenbraum and Noreen Tomasi saved and then elevated this center, which is absolutely unique in the world, so far as I know. They are both literary figures in their own right. Harold's shelf keeps expanding, continues to grow, including the collected poems of Marcel Proust, which by happy coincidence will be on sale at the back during the reception, as will Anka's beautiful new book. And before we had Fiona and I had ever met Noreen Tomasi, we saw down at the Lucille Lortel Theater a play she had written that was produced off-Broadway, which was absolutely one of the best plays we had seen in 20 years in New York. Just an extraordinary play. So this is a rare moment, and I will presume enough to speak for a lot of people here in the room. For those of us who have benefited, to offer our thanks to people who have made such a difference in our lives. How could a library on 47th Street make such a difference? Well, I'll tell you that for Fiona and me, we came to New York, to Manhattan, for the Metropolitan Opera, and we stayed for the Mercantile Library and the Center for Fiction. So, thank you both. You do not want to hear introductions at length, and so I'm going to change the format slightly, and I hope that the speakers who follow will forgive me for doing this. I'm not going to repeat what is in your programs and what is available if you want richer detail on Google, because if we were to go through the awards and publications of these speakers, we would have no time for them. So I'm going to, if they will forgive me, be extremely brief so that you can hear them and not us. And you will get a chance, as time allows, we'll of course have a dialogue with all of you, but you will all have a crack at them again, and at Anka Gulstein, when we have the conversation which Harold will lead. Well, many speakers approach their subject authoritatively. Professor Weber surrounds her subject in this case. She comes at the Duchesse with, in the first place, looking to the past with a profound knowledge of the precursors of the women of Proust. Having written on the containment or curtailment of feminine social and sexual autonomy in 18th century France, and of course there's her wonderful bestseller, Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution. Then, to come to the present and look back, are her published comments on today's Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, which lead our thoughts by just a very short path back to the Duc de Guermantes and the Duchesse's tolerance of his philandering. And she comes at it from the inside, that is, from as a profound reader of Proust's novel, and from the outside. She is currently working on a study of the aristocrats who inspired and were models for Proust's women. I'm used to introducing dusty old professors. It's such a pleasure to introduce someone who is published in Vogue.
Thank you, Stan, so much for that very very, very generous and hilarious introduction. I get older and dustier as a professor the more time passes. So, but thank you for having me here. Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Shattuck family. Thank you, Noreen. And thank you, co-panelists and Anka, for that fantastic look at Odette. I said to Harold in an email when I responded with joy about my interest in participating and talking to you a little bit about Proust's Duchess, the Duchesse de Guermantes. I said that I was actually even more excited to hear what my fellow panelists had to say, because actually I kind of like all of your characters better than I like mine. Which is very interesting, especially Madame Verdurand. Anyway, I was really struck listening to Anka's paper on Odette by the way that you stressed, and rightly so, her consistency, the consistency of this character that goes all the way to the end, and who in fact doesn't even look old by the end. If I recall, she's the only one in volume 7 at the Bal des Têtes where the narrator walks in and says, oh, I didn't realize the costume was that we should all wear our own death's heads. And it's like, oh no, it just everybody got old except Odette. So the remarkable consistency of Odette, I think, is a very interesting pendant to, or a negative mirror image of, the tremendous inconsistency of Oriane de Guermantes, the Duchess who sort of serves as the young Marcel's aristocratic ideal in two very different ways that I want to talk about, and that creates an internal consistency in this character even before she becomes for him a paradigmatic figure of disenchantment, and of the degree to which, as the narrator says somewhere in volume 3, that it is the same with names as it is with places, which is that the closer we approach them, the more they lose their magic. And Oriane starts out as the most magical of all the female characters in Proust, and by the end, she appears as something quite different. I don't want to spoil the end for anyone if you haven't gotten to volume 7, but talk a little bit about it. So I apologize, I've been working in Shanghai this semester, and I didn't have any English editions of Proust, so I'll translate as I go, but it will be a little bit awkward, and nobody should blame Moncrief or Lydia Davis or for any infelicities of expression. But I was inspired to take as my starting point today a quote from the narrator in volume 3, the Côté de Guermantes, where the narrator says, "The mind of Madame de Guermantes appealed to me precisely for what it excluded, which is to say the entire contents of my own thought." So there's this idea for the narrator that Oriane de Guermantes represents something radically other to who he is, and that otherness takes two distinct forms. One of them is as a figure of le passé mérovingien, the sort of Merovingian, do you say Merovingian, past of feudal aristocratic France, of this ancient kind of chivalric and heraldic prehistory that is associated specifically with the place name Guermantes. But that at the same time, Oriane de Guermantes represents for the narrator another world that he is equally not a part of, and that he equally doesn't have access to except through his kind of fantasies about and then his attempts to befriend Madame de Guermantes, and that's the world of Belle Époque Parisian mondanité, of sort of socialite behavior, socialite cavorting and frequentations in what's known in the language of the time as the Great World, high society in Paris. And Oriane is both this figure of kind of rustic, Merovingien, heraldic aristocracy and old, pure French blood. And on the other hand, she is the queen of fashion of Belle Époque Paris. She has the most exclusive salon, she inspires trends, she patronizes avant-garde artists like Elstir, and in these two capacities, she is a fascinating figure for the narrator. The center cannot hold in these dimensions of what the narrator idealizes in the Duchesse, and by the end we'll see her as appearing in kind of a third incarnation, which is a figure of radical disenchantment, of one more example of the narrator's discovery that the values that he thought he could seek, sort of transcendental value, the kind of reliable happiness and meaning that he could derive from travel, from family, from friendship, from the great world, are all in fact illusions, and the only place to gain that kind of stable, transcendental, reliable meaning is of course in literary art and in art more generally. So the narrator says at one point in En Passant, in volume 7, the Duchesse de Guermantes had for me been several different people. So she starts out, she's actually the first of our female characters we're discussing today, I believe, to appear in the Recherche. She appears in the form of her Merovingian avatar, Geneviève de Brabant, who is, many of you probably remember, the lady in the Magic Lantern, being chased by the evil Seneschal Golot in front of her castle. And the narrator, so she's kind of this spectral projection, or this luminous illusion projected on the walls of the narrator's childhood bedroom at Combray. And then 3 other times in Swann's Way, the narrator reminds us, exclaiming excitedly from the point of view of the child, Marcel, glorious from before Charlemagne, the Guermantes had the rights of life and death over their vassals, and the Duchesse de Guermantes descends directly from Geneviève de Brabant. How beautiful she is, he exclaims to himself at the church of Combray during the wedding of Mademoiselle Perspier. How beautiful she is, what nobility. How she is indeed a proud Guermantes, the direct descendant of Geneviève de Brabant. That's who I have right in front of me. So then the ideal seems so close, but it's so far away, precisely because she's this luminous image, a dematerialized fantasy for him. And he says, the narrator says later on in Swann's Way, that actually this sort of luminous immateriality corresponds to his more general conception of the Guermantes as these kind of elusive ideals. I knew that they were real people who actually existed, but every time I thought about them either as if they were in a tapestry, like the Comtesse de Guermantes in the crowning of Esther in our church in the country, sometimes in the changing nuances of the stained glass windows at Combray, where the ancestors of the Guermantes are also represented, and sometimes in the entirely impalpable image of Geneviève de Brabant, the ancestress of the Guermantes, that my magic lantern projected onto the walls of my bedroom. All of them enveloped in the mystery of Merovingian times and bathed as if in a sunset of orangish light which emanates from that syllable alt. The orangeness of the alt is something that he insists upon. I've never quite saisi. But okay, and so we've got this, he states it explicitly, there's the Merovingian past, and then he explains a little bit later, and one of the descendants that I was talking to for my study of the real-life women who inspired the Duchesse de Guermantes, one of these descendants said to me not so long ago in Paris, Proust didn't really understand the vie de château. Proust didn't hunt, he didn't ride well, he didn't like animals, his only deficiency in my view. And so he didn't understand, and he didn't really know the vie de château, and I have very funny stories about that for later. But Madame de Guermantes, on the contrary, for him in this incarnation, represents this sort of rusticated vieille France aristocratic life of the château. Here, somewhat ambiguously expressed, Madame de Guermantes offered to me the energy and the charm of a cruel little girl from the aristocracy in the area of Combray, who from her earliest childhood rode horses, beat up on cats, and gouged the eyes out of rabbits. She's as mean as Françoise with that chicken. But I had sought in her a provincial remainder of Guermantes. So again, this kind of vieille France, and the vieille France aspect of the Duchesse, of course, particularly manifests itself, and Holly will be talking more about this with Françoise, in her sort of deliberately and delightfully to the narrator antiquated turns of phrase. She uses these kind of old, rusticated expressions that the narrator likens to the speech of Henry IV, the excellent French of Henry IV, although I think of him as kind of an earthy, maybe not that elegantly spoken, man, le français exquis d'Henri IV, and that she had a very, he says in the Côté de Guermantes, she had an affectation to pronounce certain words in a very peasanty way. So I won't go through the long examples that the narrator gives because they're in French, and I will make them sound not even charming and peasanty, just butchered with all of the subordinated clauses. But in the middle of one of these quotes, the narrator observes, her way of pronouncing words was a real museum of the history of France. So again, she's this kind of living treasury of an old French language, an old French culture that's rooted in the land that Françoise also, of course, emblematizes. And in this way, her conversation would have been for a man of letters, a living dictionary of all those expressions which every day are being forgotten more and more, which one no longer finds except among the amiable and benevolent conservers of the past. Yes, so voila. So again, she speaks this wonderful French, and the narrator is partly fascinated by this aspect of her character. But the flip side again, the link between these two aspects of her character, is a line that the narrator offers when he's describing his life as a young man in Volume 3 and starting to make his way into Parisian high society, into the great world. He says, "The Duchesse never seemed to me more literary than when she spoke about the Faubourg Saint-Germain," which is another metonym for the great world, the kind of aristocratic old society. She never seemed more literary, and there's a follow-on to that quote, which I know you know, Anka, and a lot of you do, I'll reveal later. But anyway, so part of her literariness to him also is her access to this very rarefied world within Paris. The narrator is an upper middle class child of the professional bourgeoisie. His father has these kind of functions in the government with Monsieur de Norpois, and he sees the Parisian great world all around him, starting from when he's a child, and it's Dr. Perspier at Combray who brings over at one point some of the society pages from the Parisian newspapers reporting on the famous ball of the Princesse de Léon, where Oriane de Guermantes makes a particular splash in her outfit. And so again, there's this sort of two-dimensional basis for the ideal of Oriane in these gossip columns, but when the narrator's family moves into essentially the Hôtel Guermantes in Paris, he sees the Duchesse all the time and becomes preoccupied as a young man with what he has heard from a friend of his father's, is that there is nothing more exclusive in the Faubourg Saint-Germain than the Duchesse de Guermantes. And I told myself that if I could be received at Madame de Guermantes' house, I would know that which, under its orange envelope, its brilliant orange envelope, her name enclosed in a real objective manner for others, since the friend of my father had again said to me that the Guermantes salon was something apart in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, that her salon was the first salon, the premier salon of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Oriane de Guermantes is a double Guermantes. We are told at the beginning of the novel that she is, I have this quote in English, her family, is as grand as it gets. She is the great-granddaughter of Mademoiselle de Montpensier, and she is the 18th Oriane de Guermantes without a mésalliance. Hers is the purest blood and the oldest blood in France. Obviously that ties her to this sort of vieille France heraldic fantasy of the narrators, but it also translates into the exclusivity of her circle in Paris. The narrator imagines that even if she just wants to have relatives over for dinner, everyone is royalty or an ancient kind of famous noble name, and so even a little dinner for 12, you would have the guests like, he says, like the golden statues of the apostles in Sainte-Chapelle, symbolic pillars before the holy table. So there's this idea of this grand aristocracy that she has access to. She knows it too. And there's a very hilarious part in Volume 3 where the narrator, observing Oriane's technique for choosing the members and the visitors to her salon, is that there's an intelligence coefficient that goes down to 0 if you're an altesse, or what Odette would call a royalty, and you can be absolutely stupid and be an altesse, and you still have an important role to play in Oriane's salon. But if you are someone like the narrator, you better have a very high intelligence coefficient, because you certainly don't have a name. You can't brag about the fact that these old things, these huge rubies, they were just a little gift from the Grande Duchesse of Russia. Then it's dubious. If it's coming from the Grand Duke, everybody knows he's a dog, and so he can give Odette the cigarettes. But Oriane can brag about her royal connections all the time, which she actually does in one of my favorite parts of the example of her old speech, where she says that the narrator says that Oriane liked to talk because her grandfather had been a courtier at the court of Henry V, the Comte de Chambord, the last direct heir to the Bourbon throne. and that Oriane liked to say, oh, we old folks from Frosdorf. And that the listener forever afterward, who used to say Frosdorf, made a big point of going around and saying Frosdorf. I embarrassingly admit I used to pronounce it the wrong way, and then gotta act like you know. So she's got this sort of these Altesse, these royal associations, these glamorous associations, but for the narrator also, in these banquet years, at this time when the society of the Belle Époque is changing under the Third Republic, there is this idea, of course, of bourgeois merit and achievement, which is becoming increasingly important sociologically and is making its inroads increasingly into the great world itself. And one of the exciting things about going to Oriane's salon is also that one can see her great collection of Elstir paintings, and one can maybe meet, if one is the narrator and interested in literary celebrities and artistic celebrities, one can maybe meet a new poet or a new painter that one has admired from a distance. So this is part of the exclusivity of the Salon of Oriane. She picks so well, and Oriane understood that as in a book or as in the interior decor of a house, the quality of salon, she thought rightly, has for its keystone or its cornerstone exclusion. So who do you exclude? You exclude, in her case, all of your boring relatives and just invite the crowned heads. Her intellectualism is a big part of her shtick and a big part of her appeal to the narrator. And one of her kind of country cousins, who's always jealous of how fabulous Oriane is, Madame de Gallardon, indignantly remarks, I have heard that she recites Aristotle. The narrator's aside, she meant Aristophanes. In her salon, I would never tolerate that at my house, but Oriane loves to sort of, and Oriane is especially known not only for the intelligent and interesting people that she surrounds herself with, almost exclusively men, but she's also known for her own wit. And this is mentioned several times in the recherche as the principal appeal of the Salon of Oriane. The examples of her witticisms are many and well known, but my favorite one is the one where she talks about the new Madame de Cambremer and says, oh, well, I was wondering why, yes, it's true that she doesn't look like a cow, because Oriane is mean about overweight women. It's true that she doesn't look like a cow, she looks like a herd of cows. And to the point where when she came into my salon one day and said to me, hello, I wanted to say to her, you troop of cows, you must be mistaken. How can you come into my salon in a hat and tell me hello? Don't you know that you're a troop of cows? And then she adds, but of course then I remembered that the Infanta of Spain has something bovine about her, and she's always saying she wanted to come by. So I decided that I almost called her Your Royal Majesty, all the more so because my friend the Queen of Sweden has something of a cow-like gut. So Oriane gets the sort of indirect self-congratulation of all the Altesse she knows. She gets to be really mean, and she coins this phrase that's then quoted over and over again in the novel, and actually it had a real counterpart in Belle Époque society, that's not a cow, that's a herd. So mean. And again, she's also known as a patroness of the arts. She's a great collector of Elstir, and she's known for her taste in fashion. And there's the famous scene at the opera in the beginning of the Côté de Guermantes, where the Princesse de Guermantes, her cousin, is wearing this kind of over-the-top, extravagant, slightly in dubious taste, mermaid getup, and Oriane shows up looking like a white swan in swan's down and white muslin, strictly tailored, and looked as though she was giving her cousin a lesson in good taste. We know that Albertine really admires, that great student of fashion, admires her more than anyone else as a fashionable woman in Paris. And by the end of her life, or sort of during the Albertine era for the narrator, Oriane is wearing Fortuny dresses, so kind of a new thing in the I think the early Fortuny dresses were like 1908 or 1909. And there's one beautiful description that I want to give you, which we'll link to the last part. Her Fortuny dress appeared overwritten with Arabic ornaments, like Venice, like Venetian Doge's palace, hidden as if they were sultans' wives, behind an intricate veil of stone, like the bindings of books in the Ambrosiana library, like the columns in San Marco's Basilica, whose oriental bird motifs alternatively signify life and death. These motifs are woven into the shimmering fabric of the Duchesse's dress. Now, we readers of Proust know that when Venice is mentioned, we're in the presence of another ideal that is that's also a source of disenchantment. Our narrator dreams forever of going to Venice and finds that it also can't possibly correspond to his fantasies. And Oriane in her Fortuny gown, evoking Venice and evoking these oriental birds, these pelicans, specifically the symbols of the resurrection and the life of Christ. She represents both the life and the death of an ideal. And it turns out that all along, but especially by the end of the novel, Oriane has been carrying with her not only this ideality, but also its opposite, or its negation. Her respect for the men of letters and her disdain for them were stronger than she actually realized herself, he says. There's a great scene in the Côté de Guermantes where the narrator is really excited at his first dinner to meet and talk to a poet there whose work he's admired, and Oriane, to prove how sophisticated she is and on what familiar terms she's with all these artists, she refuses to let the poet ever talk about his work and only keeps quizzing him about how much does he like the eggs that she's had sent, especially from Guermantes, and her eggs, like everything else in her house, were the best things in the world. So the artistic possibility of going to Oriane's salon is negated. Her sense of humor is mean and actually not that funny, and with all due respect, there are a lot of puns that just are not funny at all, and they get repeated more and more, and there's the painful awareness, if you're the reader or the narrator, that actually Oriane's great wit, which is described frequently as the wit of Meillac and Halévy, is actually just not funny. Her relationship to fashion actually itself is presented as kind of problematic and undermines her ideality or her transcendence as this lofty ideal, and there's this beautiful passage in the Côté de Guermantes where the narrator watches her looking at another fashionable woman on the street and being so vulgar as to think that somebody else could be a tribunal for her. And then he says it's like some of those like a swan who has been transformed in mythology from a divine form, and then suddenly starts acting like a swan and pecks at an umbrella or a button, and then that she is like a swan who's forgotten that she's a god. This amazing Proustian conceit. And not only has she forgotten that she's a god, she's forgotten that she's a fish. In the last scene of the novel, the famous Bal des Têtes, the extended matinee at the Madame Verdurin's, the Princesse de Guermantes' house, Oriane has the longest conversation with the narrator, and her words are ringing in his ears at the end like the trumpets of the Last Judgment, he says, before he has his famous epiphany that he needs to write. And Oriane she's become meaner than she ever was. She is now officially ugly and looks like a sacred fish. Her exclusive salon has become degraded, and the only people she thinks are delicious to spend time with anymore are actresses like Rachel, whose romance with her nephew Saint-Loup, Oriane had actively and cruelly broken up. And that in the end, she winds up as this figure of, as the narrator says, the Duchesse de Guermantes. That's who that was. That's all that was. Thank you.